I want to say I was the one who noticed first. That would make a better accounting. It would give the record a shape. Junior technician, third-tier station, fresh out of the Continuance Academy, with a mapping wand and an overactive intuition, who looked at an anomalous fold remnant in the approach corridor and felt something contract at the base of his chest that the senior officers did not feel, and who said so, clearly, before the array crossed into range. That would be a clean narrative, cautionary, almost heroic. That is not what happened. What happened is that I logged the remnant as a natural formation on the morning of the array's 8th day in transit, appended the standard notation fold remnant, probable stellar compression artifact, no navigational hazard, recommend avoidance margin 0.4 light seconds, and moved on to the next sector of the survey map. My supervisor, range analyst Kethra Vaughn, reviewed my notation and accepted it without comment. Continuance Commander Varath Sanuel, who commanded the KDV immovable argument and through it the full 9,200 vessel Karath Continuance Array, was briefed on my sector report for approximately 11 seconds before moving to the matter of fuel consumption projections for the crossing. The anomaly sat at coordinates I had personally surveyed, classified, and dismissed. It had been sitting there for 900 years. I have had a great deal of time since then to think about what I missed, and the honest answer is that I missed everything that mattered, and that nothing in my training would have helped me see it. The Karath Dominion Spatial Continuance Academy trains dimensional mappers to find things that should not be there. Structures, weapons, platforms, fold anchor beacons that an enemy fleet has seeded into the corridor ahead of their advance. We are trained to identify the impossible by comparing it against a known catalog of dimensional architectures and to flag anything that falls outside the parameters of natural formation. The ISV permanent record was not in the catalog. It had been removed from the catalog 900 years ago, along with every other human hull known to the Dominion. When the border reckoning of the 17th Continuance expansion concluded that humanity's fleet had been destroyed and the species classified as extinct, the removal was administrative, neat, thorough. The humans had built ships that crossed dimensional folds rather than traveling around them. Ships whose hull material was compressed across multiple spatial layers simultaneously, rendering them invisible to standard dimensional survey, because no instrument calibrated for a 3-layer search architecture would recognize a 17-layer signal as an artifact rather than a natural anomaly. Those ships had engaged the Dominion's advance elements in the approach corridor. Those advance elements had reported their engagements and then gone silent. The Dominion's Reckoning Committee had spent 3 standard years debating whether the silence meant victory or catastrophic loss, and had concluded, on the strength of the fact that no human fleet had subsequently appeared to prosecute any advantage, that it was victory. The human ships had been destroyed. The species had been classified as extinct. The file had been closed. The notation in the archive read, humanity, Terran designation, classification, extinct, fleet status, destroyed, threat assessment, null, date of closure. 900 years prior. A clean file, an old file, the sort of file that junior technicians do not re-examine when they are mapping approach corridors for a routine expansion push. I did not re-examine it. What I did instead, on the morning of the 8th day, was note that the fold remnant at the corridor's edge had 17 distinct spatial signatures, which is unusual. Most natural fold remnants have between 2 and 4, but which I attributed to a particularly complex stellar compression event of the kind that occurs near binary systems, where the gravitational interaction warps local space into a multi-layered fold geometry. I had studied 6 documented cases in the Academy's reference archive, and the signature was broadly consistent with what those cases described. Broadly, not precisely. The layering in those 6 cases was uneven, the kind of uneven that natural processes produce, where each layer has a slightly different density gradient, and the boundaries between layers are ragged. The 17 layers in Sector 4 Mark 7 were even, consistent. The boundaries were clean. I noted this as a curiosity in my margin log. I did not escalate it. I flagged the anomaly as interesting. I recommended the avoidance margin. I filed my report. That night, in the crew section of KDV Immovable Argument's third deck, I ate a meal that I remember, with a clarity I would prefer not to have. Something pressed and warm and slightly overcooked, the way the ship's preparation units always managed when running at full array maintenance load. I talked with my bunkmate, survey analyst Prethis, about whether we would be given leave allocation after the corridor crossing, and whether the expansion push into the new sector was likely to encounter resistance from any of the listed civilizations in the approach zone. Not likely, Prethis said. He was older than me by 12 years and had been on 4 prior expansion pushes, none of which had produced a significant engagement. The Dominion had been expanding through surveyed corridors for 11 decades without a significant engagement. There was a generation of analysts and commanders who had built entire careers on the foundation of that unbroken record and who carried the foundation's weight without noticing it, because a foundation that is never cracked does not announce itself. It is simply what the structure sits on. The listed ones we've surveyed already. The Veth Collective, the Orvani Passage States. They don't fight. They calculate the continuance doctrine, and they fold before we arrive. And the unlisted? He shrugged, the way experienced technicians shrug, not dismissive, just unhurried. There are no unlisted threats in a surveyed corridor. That's the point of the survey. I nodded and finished my meal and said nothing about the 17 even layers in Sector 4 Mark 7, because I had already filed my report and my supervisor had already accepted it, and the formation was already in transit, and raising a concern at this stage would have required me to produce a technical justification that I did not have. Curiosity is not a technical justification. Clean layer boundaries in a natural remnant are unusual, but not unprecedented. I had no basis for an escalation that would not have been set aside as overcaution from an inexperienced mapper on his second assignment. In the morning, I would understand why that self-assessment was the second most important mistake I made in those 10 days. The first was filing the report in the first place, with the natural formation notation, before I had finished the analysis that the uneven versus even boundary question required. The correct procedure, which the Academy teaches, but which operational pressure encourages analysts to shorten, is to complete the comparative analysis before notating. I notated first. I had 17 sectors left to survey before the end of the shift, and the comparative analysis was going to take 40 minutes, and I was behind on my survey pace. I was always behind on my survey pace. I am a thorough technician. Thoroughness and survey pace are in permanent tension on expansion missions, and the doctrine resolves the tension in favor of pace because the doctrine has never needed the thoroughness that would have changed anything. The array entered the approach corridor on day 9 at a standard transit depth of 11 light hours. The 9,200 vessels spread across a formation envelope 12 light hours wide and 3 light hours deep, which is the continuance doctrine's preferred deployment for corridor crossings. I had stood at the observation port for the transit entry and watched the formation align from the KDV Immovable Arguments position at the center aft of the envelope, and the sight of it, 9,200 vessels, calibrated to a common spacing and a common heading. The outer element's running lights, describing the geometry of an envelope larger than many star systems, was genuinely impressive. I want to record that I found it impressive, because the things that impressed me in those days are part of the accounting too, and the accounting should be complete. The formation creates 17 overlapping dimensional compression fields, each capable of folding any designated spatial volume to subdimensional depth within 6 seconds of target acquisition. Anything the array points its compression fields at is, within that 6-second window, effectively removed from the functional universe and deposited into a pocket of collapsed spatial geometry from which it cannot engage, navigate, or communicate. The pocket does not destroy the target. It contains it in a spatial address that is not accessible from the primary dimensional layers in which the war is conducted. It is a doctrine that converts the enemy's spatial position into a liability rather than a resource. Once your position has been folded, the spatial address the pocket occupies is defined by the folding force, and the folding force can maintain or release the pocket on its own terms. In 400 years of expansion doctrine, nothing had ever engaged a continuance array in full formation and survived. Not 3 war fleets, not 11 weapons platforms, not 2 planetary defense networks, Not one civilization's attempt at a fold anchor superweapon. The doctrine had never failed. The operational assumption derived from that record was that there was no known spatial architecture that could resist a 17-layer simultaneous compression salvo, because the salvo covered every dimensional layer in which a physical object could exist and function. The operating assumption had a flaw. The flaw was small and invisible from inside the record that had built the assumption, because the flaw only became relevant if the target was already in all 17 layers before the salvo fired. No documented target had ever been in all 17 layers before a salvo fired. The archive confirmed this. All documented cases in the archive were accounted for. The archive was complete. What the archive did not contain what had been removed from it 900 years ago with the notation extinct and threat assessment. Null was the class of vessel that existed in 17 layers simultaneously as a matter of its fundamental design, not as a weapon or a defensive system, but as a property of its hull material. A vessel that did not compress into a dimensional pocket because it was already in every pocket that could be made. A vessel that the Dominion had decided did not exist anymore. Continuance Commander Varath Sanul held the array's standard formation review on the morning of Day 10 with a composure that I found reassuring. He reviewed the sensor reports, mine included, and found nothing of concern. The fold remnant at Sector 4 Mark 7 was in my report with the natural formation notation. He had reviewed it for 11 seconds the previous day. He reviewed it for perhaps 4 seconds this morning. He moved on to the transit schedule. He noted, with the kind of measured satisfaction that I associated with commanders who kept careful track of operational milestones, that the array was on pace for the corridor crossing and that the expansion push into the new sector was proceeding exactly as planned. He was not the kind of commander who gloated. He was the kind of commander who found reassurance in the match between plan and execution and communicated that reassurance to his staff in the way that good commanders communicate things they believe, not by saying them directly, but by not finding them worth comment. I watched him, and I thought about the 17 even layers in my margin log, and I said nothing. On Day 10, the fold remnant at the corridor's edge began to change geometry. I was at my mapping station at 1311 when my instruments registered the shift. The remnant's 17 spatial layers, which had been stable for the full duration of my survey, were realigning, not collapsing, not expanding, but reorganizing. The way layers realign when a fold shifts from a static equilibrium into a dynamic one, the way they realign in the Academy's reference archive when a fold anchor activates. The clean boundary lines I had noted, and not escalated, were becoming cleaner, more precise. The kind of precision that natural processes do not produce, because nature does not optimize. Only things with a purpose optimize. I stared at my instruments for approximately 8 seconds. Then I called my supervisor, Range Analyst Kethrivan. I said, I have an anomalous geometry change in the fold remnant at Sector 4 Mark 7. The 17-layer signature is realigning. It looks like. Natural shift, he said, without looking up from his own display. Multi-layer remnants are dynamic. You noted the unusual layer count in your report. This is consistent with an active compression artifact. Log it and continue the survey. I looked at my instruments again. The realignment had accelerated. Sir, I said, the rate of change is. Log it, Sethron Vaughn. I logged it. Fold remnant sector, 4 MARK 7. Geometry shift noted. Rate. Accelerating probable cause. Dynamic compression artifact activity. No threat assessment change. For 22 minutes, nothing else happened. The array continued its transit. The formation held its envelope. I sat at my station and I watched my instruments, and I felt the particular stillness of a mapping technician who has made a notation he is not certain is correct, but lacks the standing to push further. And I watched the 17 layers realign with a methodical, incremental precision that I was beginning to understand was not natural at all. Then my instruments told me that the 17 layers had finished realigning and that what I was now reading was not a fold remnant. I sat with that information for 4 seconds, running the comparison manually because I did not trust the automated analysis. cross-checking the new geometry against every natural formation in the Academy's reference database and finding zero matches. Then I ran it against the dimensional architecture profiles in the survey catalog, the profiles for weapons platforms, fold anchor beacons, known alien structural geometries, and found zero matches there either. Then, because I was thorough in a way that had not yet served me well, I went to the archive's deep storage, the files that had been closed and not re-examined, the historical records that the active threat database had been organized on top of, the way a city builds on older foundations without ever needing to disturb them. The Dominion's archive is organized by classification status. Active threats at the top, archived extinctions at the bottom. I had never accessed the extinction files before. There was no reason to. Extinct species do not build new things. The files are maintained out of institutional habit and historical completeness, not operational relevance. I access them now by running the dimensional architecture profile I was reading against every entry in the archive, active and archived together, because I had run out of matches in the active section and I was a thorough technician, and the 17 layers in Sector 4 Mark 7 had clean boundary lines and were now showing internal structural organization that my instruments were resolving, with increasing clarity, as intentional geometry. The archive returned one result: Humanity Terran designation, classification, extinct, hull architecture, fold compressed matter, 1-7, layer, concurrent spatial presence, threat assessment. Null, date of closure, 900 years prior. I looked at my instruments. I looked at the archive entry. I looked at my instruments again. The mass in Sector 4 Mark 7 had begun to move. I have been asked, in the inquiries that followed, whether I immediately escalated to Continuance Commander Varath Sanul. I have been honest in my answers. I escalated to Kethra Vaughn. Kethra Vaughn reviewed my archive comparison and told me that the fold-compressed hull architecture in the Extinct Humanity file was a theoretical design note, not a confirmed vessel specification that the Reckoning Committee had flagged it as speculative, derived from sensor readings that were never fully verified, and that I was pattern matching a coincidence. The species has been extinct for 9 centuries, he said. You are reading a complex natural formation and finding a shape that your brain wants to see because you are tired and you have been staring at 17-layer geometries all morning. File the movement log and take your rest period. I filed the movement log. I did not take my rest period. I sat at my station and watched the formation in Sector 4 Mark 7 resolve, over the course of the next 40 minutes, from a moving mass with 17 spatial signatures into a shape. Not a suggestion of a shape, not a reading that required interpretation, a shape that my instruments rendered as a 3-dimensional projection onto my mapping screen, and that the projection showed as a hull. A hull that was 44 kilometers long, a hull that was wider at the aft section than the fore, with a geometry that suggested the aft mass was not simply structural, but was the dormant housing for a weapons configuration of a type that the Dominion's archive had no entry for. A hull that showed, along its dorsal surface, what the mapping instruments identified as window port arrays, not powered, not currently active, but structurally present. The geometrically organized cavities of interior spaces that had not been illuminated in a very long time, but that were shaped unmistakably to be. The hull was dark. Every instrument I had confirmed it. No active power signature, no drive emissions, no weapons system warming, no communication output. In the dimensional layer visible to my standard mapping instruments, the hull simply drifted, cold and silent, on a trajectory that was carrying it toward the corridor's navigational center at a velocity consistent with 9 centuries of minor gravitational influence. An object that had been drifting since before anyone in this formation had been born, since before their parents had been born, since before the Reckoning Committee that closed the file had met for the first time to review the fragmentary transmissions from the advance elements that had gone silent. In the 14 additional dimensional layers that my instruments confirmed it occupied simultaneously, I could not assess its activity. The Dominion's mapping technology operates primarily in the first 3 spatial layers, The instruments that read the deeper layers, layers 4 through 17, are designed for reading natural formations, for anomalous fold activity, for the kind of passive dimensional geometry that nature produces. They are not designed for active monitoring of an entity that already occupies those layers as a matter of its fundamental construction, the way a fish is not designed to assess the quality of the air above the water's surface. I escalated to Varath Sanul at 1417. The continuance commander reviewed my projection for 40 seconds in a silence that was entirely characteristic of him, not disturbed, but recalibrating. The expression on his face was the expression of a man who has been handed a variable that his model did not include and is determining with considerable efficiency what the model now requires. "You are saying this is a human hull," he said. "I am saying the dimensional architecture matches the archival specification exactly. 17 concurrent layers, fold compressed matter, hull massing consistent with documented Terran warship class." The archive notes the specification as speculative, but the match is exact, and the deviation from natural formation parameters is outside any range the reference database supports. "The species is extinct." "Yes, sir. The file was closed 900 years ago." He looked at the projection for another 10 seconds. Then he looked at the formation envelope around us. 9,200 vessels, 17 overlapping compression fields. The most comprehensive spatial control architecture the Dominion had ever deployed in a corridor crossing, and I watched the recalibration complete. His certainty reasserted itself. It was not denial. It was a genuine calculation, and the calculation was not wrong given the information he had. One hull, 44 kilometers, cold and unpowered, and possibly not even functional after 9 centuries of dormancy, against 9,200 vessels, and a doctrine that had never failed in 400 years. "Interesting," he said. "Lock compression targeting on the contact. I want a full acquisition solution within 3 minutes. We will compress the anomaly out of the corridor and continue the crossing." "Sir," I said, "the hull is in 17 spatial layers. Our compression fields operate in the first 3. "Yes." He looked at me with the patience that senior officers use on junior technicians who have identified a problem that the senior officer has already considered. "The fold compressed architecture means a standard single-layer compression will not fully displace it. We will fire concurrently across all 17 field generators. 17 layers, 17 simultaneous compressions. The contact will have nowhere to go." It was a reasonable solution. It was the correct application of doctrine to an unusual parameter. I had no counter-argument that my instruments could produce. The solution covered all 17 layers simultaneously and was operationally sound. I sat down. I watched the targeting solution develop on the array's tactical display. I noted that the contact was still dark, still showing no active power signature, still drifting at its long-established velocity. It was not accelerating. It was not deploying weapons. It was not doing anything at all, as far as every instrument I had could determine. It had been doing nothing at all for 900 years. Varath Sanul gave the order at 14 hours, 33 minutes and 7 seconds by the ship's internal clock. The continuance array fired its compression fields in 17 simultaneous layered salvos, each tuned to a different spatial depth, at 14 hours, 33 minutes and 14 seconds. The contact absorbed the salvo, not deflected, not resisted in any way that produced a measurable defensive signature. Absorbed. All 17 compression fields engaged their targets. I could confirm this on my instruments. Could see the spatial fold indicators confirming that all 17 layers at the contact's position had been successfully initiated, and the contact simply remained in all of them. It was already occupying all 17 layers. The compression folds were not surrounding it. They were not isolating it. They were opening into spatial pockets that the hull was already inside, had always been inside, because the hull did not exist in a single layer that could be pocketed away from the others. The hull was the 17 layers. The fields found the hull in every pocket they opened, and the hull sat in each pocket unchanged, and the fields found nothing to close on because there was no version of the hull that existed in fewer layers than the fields had created. You cannot compress something out of a spatial layer if the thing already exists in all of them. I understood this in the 3 seconds it took my instruments to confirm that the contact was unchanged. I think Varath Sanul understood it in approximately the same window, because I heard him take one breath, a specific kind of breath, the kind that precedes a statement that the speaker did not expect to make, and then the contact's power signature came online. All of it, all at once. 44 kilometers of hull, dark and cold and patient for 9 centuries. And it came alive in a single pulse of power output that my instruments registered as more than 60 times the combined output of all 9,200 vessels in the array, not warming, not building, not the graduated power-up sequence of a vessel coming out of standby. Fully operational, instantaneously, the way a system comes online when it was never actually off, when it was simply waiting, every process held at a fraction of a percent of operating capacity, present in 17 layers of space, watchful and patient, and containing nothing that needed to announce itself until it chose to. The window arrays along the dorsal hull illuminated, every one of them, simultaneously. A warm light that my instruments told me was the spectral signature of Terran interior lighting, a specific frequency range that humans had used in their vessels for reasons that the Dominion's archive attributed to biological preference. The kind of light their bodies had evolved under, carried with them into the dark of corridors where no such light would otherwise exist. In the cold of the approach corridor, with nothing around it but the light scatter of a distant primary and the shadows of a formation that had been absolutely certain of what it was doing 14 seconds ago, that warm frequency read as something other than operational illumination. It read as a ship waking up and knowing exactly where it was. I said, "Sir, the contact has—" "I see it," Varath Sanul said. Then the ISV permanent record fired. I want to be precise about what I mean when I say that, because the word fires implies a directionality, a weapon leaving a source and traveling toward a target, and that is not what happened. What happened was that the hull's weapon systems operated through the same dimensional architecture that the hull itself occupied. The weapons existed in 17 spatial layers simultaneously. When they discharged into all 17 layers at once. Not in 17 separate events, but in a single discharge, whose 17-layer propagation meant that there was no spatial location within the array's formation envelope that was not, in some dimensional layer, the target. The continuance array had fired 17 compression fields at the contact. Those fields had each opened a pocket in a different spatial layer. The pockets were still open. Compression fields do not close instantly. The doctrine assumed targets would be inside the pockets, not already occupying them before the salvo fired. 17 sets of dimensional pockets, arranged around and through the contact's position like a cage whose bars were made of borrowed space, and the contact used them. The first discharge lasted 11 seconds. When my instruments resolved, 417 vessels of the array were gone. Not destroyed in the conventional sense, not reduced to debris, not generating the heat signature and mass dispersal pattern that conventional weapons produce. Gone. Removed. The formation envelope had 417 clean gaps where ships had been, and the gaps were the exact geometry of the compression pockets the array had opened. We had handed it the weapon. We had handed it 417 uses of the weapon. We had opened 17 pockets around a hull that already occupied all 17 layers, and the hull had discharged through every pocket we made, simultaneously, into the formation that had made them. I understood this in the 8 seconds it took my instruments to register and compile the loss count. Varath Sanul moved from the observation post to the tactical station with a speed I had not seen from him before. He was still composed. The composure was different now. It was the composure of a commander who has received a catastrophic revision to his operational model and is rebuilding in real time, fast, because fast is what the situation requires. He ordered the compression fields collapsed. All of them, across the entire array, on the reasoning that the contact was weaponizing the pockets the fields had opened and that closing the pockets would remove the mechanism. He ordered conventional weapons brought online, direct fire systems, systems that do not require dimensional fold architecture to function. He ordered a coordinated volley every surviving vessel, simultaneously aimed at the contact. The array had 31 seconds before the second discharge. I have thought about those 31 seconds many times. Not the 31 seconds of any single interval in isolation, but the first one, the one that followed the opening discharge, when Varith Sanul ordered the compression fields collapsed and the conventional weapons online and coordinated his remaining vessels for a simultaneous volley. In 31 seconds, he produced a tactical adaptation that should have been impossible given that nothing in the doctrine had ever required him to adapt at all, and he produced it coherently, in the right order, without wasted motion. I watched him work and I thought, with the part of my mind that was not occupied with instruments and loss counts and the implications of what I was reading, that if anyone in the Dominion service could find a counter to a thing that existed in 17 spatial layers, it was this commander. The conventional volley was not a counter. A weapon that exists in 17 spatial layers simultaneously is not more present in 3 of those layers than in any other. The volley contacted the target. The instruments confirmed this. The target was unchanged. The second discharge lasted 9 seconds and removed 604 more vessels from the formation envelope. Then, 31 seconds. Another discharge, 582 vessels. The pattern held without variation for 4 hours and 17 minutes. Discharge, 31 seconds. Discharge, 31 seconds. I sat at my mapping station and I watched my instruments and I counted, which was the only function my instruments could perform that was producing usable output. And I watched the formation icons on the display change from their active color to gray in groups, systematically, with the regularity of a process that had been designed from the beginning to produce a specific outcome and was proceeding toward that outcome without urgency and without deviation. I want to describe what it is like to sit at a mapping station during a continuance array engagement that is going badly. The station itself does not change. The instruments do not change. The displays are the same displays I look at every day, arranged in the same configuration, lit with the same quiet operational illumination. The cup of processed grain drink that I had been working through when the first discharge happened sat at the left edge of my console for the entirety of the engagement, and I did not drink from it again. And it was still there when the engagement ended. These details are not important tactically, but they are part of the record, and the record should be complete. What changes when an engagement like that one begins is the relationship between what you can see and what you can do. My instruments were functioning perfectly throughout. They told me, continuously and accurately, exactly what was happening. The discharge, the gaps in the formation, the contact's unchanged position, the 31-second interval. The next discharge. Everything I saw on my instruments was true and current and precisely calibrated. None of it helped. I was watching a record being made in real time, and I had no capacity to influence what the record contained because the instruments that read dimensional geometry do not also correct it. And the dimensional geometry was the problem, and the problem was beyond the reach of anything at my station. This is different from being afraid. Fear requires uncertainty about the outcome. I was not uncertain about the outcome by the end of the first hour. What I felt was something colder and more specific than fear. The feeling of a technician who is doing his job correctly, producing accurate and continuous readings, and understanding that the accuracy and continuity of the readings changes nothing and will not change anything, and that the most professionally adequate thing he can do is keep the instruments running and keep the counts current, and sit with the knowledge that the thing his instruments are reading has been in that corridor for 900 years, and has not moved and is not going to move and will still be there after the count reaches 0. Kethrav On was dead by the 3rd hour. His station had taken structural damage from a compression feedback when one of the array's attempted fold shields propagated incorrectly through the hull. I did not know this until after the engagement ended. I had been watching my instruments the whole time, and the structural damage had occurred in a section of the operational floor that was behind and to the left of my station. And I had heard something that I had not fully processed because I was watching my instruments. And I processed it afterward when I found the damage and the absence where Kethravon had been. I thought when I processed it about the morning he had told me to log the anomaly and take my rest period. I do not think he was wrong. Exactly. He did not know what the anomaly was. I did not know what the anomaly was. Neither of us had the information that would have changed the decision, and the information that would have changed the decision was in the extinction files that no one had any reason to access, because extinct species do not require active monitoring. The logic was sound. The logic was just wrong about the fundamental premise. The logic of the entire Dominion's approach to that corridor was wrong about the fundamental premise. Varath Sanul tried everything. He tried things the doctrine contained and things it did not. He attempted to use the compression fields as shields rather than weapons, folding volumes of space between the array and the contact rather than at the contact, creating dimensional barriers that a 17-layer weapon system would have to propagate through rather than into open formation. The permanent record's discharges propagated through the barriers without deviation, because a weapon that exists in 17 layers simultaneously does not need to travel through a barrier that exists in 3. The barrier had the same relationship to the weapon that a wall built in one room has to a fire burning in all the rooms simultaneously. He attempted a scatter in the 3rd hour, when the formation had been reduced below 2,000 vessels. He ordered every surviving hull to break on individual bearings, 17 different vectors, the formation dispersing into a cloud of single ships spread across a volume too large for a single target acquisition system to hold. The permanent record did not appear to use a single target acquisition system. The scatter reduced the formation's density without reducing the dimensional coverage of the weapons, and the 31-second intervals continued unchanged. He attempted communication in the 4th hour, a direct frequency broadcast on the Archive's recorded Terran communication spectrum, a formal Dominion contact protocol that I had not seen used before, because formal contact protocols are not part of expansion mission training. They are a different department's toolkit. The toolkit for diplomatic engagement, which the continuance doctrine does not generally require. I do not know exactly what he transmitted. I was not monitoring the communications board. What I know is that it went out and received no response, and 31 seconds later, the discharge happened, and the contact had not changed its bearing or its range. It had been in that corridor for 900 years. If it had something to say, it had said it with the first discharge. At the engagement's 4th hour and 3rd minute, I noted something that I reported to Varath Sanul, not because I knew what to do with it, but because I was a thorough technician and the information was present in my instruments and needed to be in the record. Sir, the contact has not approached the formation. He looked at me. In 4 hours of engagement, I said, it has not closed distance. Every discharge has operated at the original engagement range. It is not advancing. He looked at the tactical display. He looked at the range indicator, which had been consistent to within 0.001 light seconds since 14 hours 33 minutes and 14 seconds. He was quiet for 6 seconds, and I watched the quality of the silence change. It doesn't need to, he said. No, I said, but it has chosen not to. I don't know entirely why I said that second sentence. It was not a tactical observation. It did not change anything. But it was true, and the truth of it had been accumulating in my instruments for 4 hours, and I said it because I needed to know whether someone else in the room understood what I understood, which was this. A weapon system that operates at maximum effectiveness from a fixed position against a target that cannot close range or break contact does not hold its position because it must. It holds its position because it has decided that holding its position is what the situation requires. That is not a systems decision. That is not what weapons do. Weapons fire. Weapons cycle. Weapons engage. What the permanent record was doing was something older and heavier than engagement. It was holding a line. Varath Sanul understood. He said nothing further. He turned back to the tactical display and continued issuing adaptations that I believe he already knew would not change the outcome because he was a commander, and a commander does not stop trying. And because in the absence of any other option, trying is what you do. The 31-second interval never varied by more than 0.4 seconds across all 219 discharges. I timed each one manually. I don't know exactly why I started doing this. It was not a mapped function, not a task I had been assigned, not something that had any clear use in the moment. But once I started, I could not stop, because the interval's absolute consistency was telling me something that I could not fully articulate, and timing it was the closest I could come to having the conversation that it seemed to be inviting. 219 discharges, 219 intervals, 4 hours and 17 minutes, and the thing in Sector 4 Mark 7 never moved and never hurried and never wavered. And I sat at my station and watched the formation dissolve into gray icons, and I thought about what it means for something to wait 900 years in a corridor where the civilization that last engaged it had concluded that the engagement produced a victory, and that the conclusion was wrong, and that the error had sat uncorrected in an administrative file for 900 years, and that the thing waiting in the corridor had known about the error the entire time. At 18 hours, 50 minutes, and 22 seconds, the 219th discharge completed, and my instruments showed a formation envelope that contained 13 hulls, 13 of 9,200. The KDV, immovable argument, was the largest surviving hull, and it was tumbling on a vector imparted by debris pressure from the vessels on our immediate flanks in the final discharges. Our compression systems were offline. Our conventional weapons were offline. 7 of the 13 surviving hulls showed no power output at all. Varath Sanul was at the tactical station, standing in the tumbling, because he had chosen to stand, and the choice was the last operational decision he had available to him, and he made it without qualification. Contact status, he said. The permanent record had not moved. It was at exactly the position it had occupied at 14 hours, 33 minutes, and 14 seconds, 0.4 light seconds, from the corridor's navigational center in Sector 4 Mark 7. Its power output was unchanged. Its 17 spatial layers were fully occupied. Its window arrays were still illuminated, the warm Terran frequency steady and even, the interior light of a ship that was awake and present, and in no hurry to be anywhere else. Contact is stationary, I said. Weapons systems show standby state across all 17 layers. Varath Sanul did not respond. He looked at the display for a long time. Then the signal came. Single transmission. The frequency matched the archive records. Our signals team, working from the archival database, produced a translation over 3 days that required reconstructing a communication protocol the Dominion had last used during the border reckoning 9 centuries ago, when it was actively engaged with human fleet elements in a corridor that it subsequently decided had been cleared. The translators cautioned that precision was uncertain. The archival records of human communication were incomplete, derived from intercepted transmissions under field conditions, and the protocol had been partially reconstructed from context rather than direct transcription. The translation was consistent across every interpretive approach they tried. File updated. 2 words, or the equivalent in a grammatical structure the translators noted was designed for transmission efficiency rather than meaning richness, a grammar that implied a record-keeping framework. That the specific term translated as file was drawn from an administrative vocabulary referring to formal classification documents, that the full contextual meaning was something closer to the record that designated this corridor's custodial status has been corrected to reflect the facts as they currently exist. The permanent record broadcast the signal 3 times at intervals of exactly 31 seconds. Then, its window arrays dimmed. Not all at once, the light faded gradually, the warm Terran frequency narrowing and pulling back, the way embers pull back when the fire they belong to has done what it needed to do and does not need to be large anymore. The drive signature shifted from active operational to the low output state I recognized from my 8th-day survey, the state I had read as cold dormancy and logged as a natural formation. Not off, not dead, standby. The state of a system that has completed its current task and returned to its baseline posture, present in 17 simultaneous spatial layers, patient, watchful in a way that does not announce itself to instruments calibrated for threats, because it is not a threat. It is a custodian. It is something that holds a position because the position was given to it, and the position still requires holding, and it will hold it for another 900 years if necessary. Because 900 years is not a long time if the corridor is what matters, and the corridor is what you were built to hold. I watched the permanent record spatial signature settle back into the configuration I had surveyed on the 8th day and classified as a natural fold remnant, and I sat with my instruments, and with the 13 hull icons on the formation display, and with the 2-word translation, and I thought about the Reckoning Committee's file. The silence of the advance elements 9 centuries ago had not been the silence of a completed victory. It had been the silence of a corridor that was held, and that would keep being held, and that would communicate this to any force that entered it in exactly the way that the permanent record had communicated it to us. The Dominion had interpreted the silence as evidence that there was nothing left to be silent. The silence had actually been the corridor itself, maintained, patient, waiting to be tested again. The file had been wrong for 900 years. The archive had been wrong for 900 years. The threat assessment notation, null, had been wrong for 900 years. And the thing that made it wrong had been present the whole time, in 17 spatial layers, at 0.4 light seconds from the corridor's navigational center, in a sector that a junior technician had surveyed and classified as a natural fold remnant because the archive he was cross-checking against did not contain an entry that matched what he was seeing, because the entry that would have matched had been moved to the extinction files before he was born. I have spent 31 years thinking about the Reckoning Committee and what they missed. They were thorough analysts, the record shows. They spent 3 years reviewing the data. They applied the Dominion's standard evidentiary framework, the framework that had served the expansion reliably for 400 years before the border reckoning and for 900 years after. The framework asks, has the threat produced further hostile activity? If the answer is no, the threat has been neutralized. The advance element's silence was the last communication on record. The humans had not subsequently appeared. The framework concluded, neutralized. The framework was not designed for a civilization that holds positions rather than prosecuting advantages. That responds to aggression by neutralizing the aggressor and returning to its post rather than following the aggressor home. That was, apparently, perfectly comfortable waiting in a 17-layer spatial configuration for whatever came next, with no urgency about when next would arrive. The framework had never needed to account for that kind of patience, because the Dominion had never encountered it before. Every civilization they had engaged had either fought with the intent to win territory or collapsed and folded before the array arrived. None of them had simply held a line. The signal said file updated, and what the update was, what the record had been corrected to reflect was this: the corridor is held. It was always held. The 900 years of null threat assessment was a 900-year error in the archive of a civilization that built its expansion doctrine on the completeness of that archive. The permanent record did not need to announce this loudly. It had been announcing it the entire time. The announcement was simply that it existed in 17 spatial layers at the position it had been given. Any force that entered the corridor and looked carefully enough would eventually notice the announcement. What happened next was up to them. In the hour after the engagement ended, and before the first of the 13 surviving hulls was able to establish a stable communications link with the others, there was very little to do on the tumbling KDV immovable argument, except wait. The ship's systems were running on tertiary power. The tumble was slow, a quarter rotation every 14 minutes, which I know because I timed it. Because timing things was the habit I had developed during the engagement, and the habit did not stop when the engagement stopped. The operational floor was quiet in a way that operational floors are not usually quiet, which is a specific kind of quiet that I do not have a better description for than the absence of everything that normally fills it. Varith Sanuel had not spoken since the contact status reports. He stood at the tactical station for a long time, looking at the display that was now mostly gray icons, And then he sat down in the commander's chair, and he looked at the gray icons. And I watched him from my station with the instruments running and the cup of grain drink still at the left edge of my console, untouched since 1433. And I thought about the 11 seconds he had spent reviewing my sector report on day 8, and I did not blame him for it. Because I had written the report, and I had written the natural formation notation, and I had not finished the analysis that the even boundary lines required before I filed it. We were the same error, expressed at different levels of the command structure. He said eventually, without looking up from the display, "How long has it been there?" The archive notation gives the date of the extinction file closure as 900 years prior. I said, "The hull was in the corridor before that the advance elements reported contact during the border reckoning period. The exact duration is not recorded." He was quiet for a while. The hull completed its slow tumble. The distant primary came into the viewport and passed out of it and came back again. "It was there when we were mapping the corridor," he said, "when the advance elements went in, when the committee reviewed the reports and closed the file." "Yes, sir." "And nothing changed for it. In 900 years. The archive shows no subsequent contact reports for this corridor," I said. "The expansion push we were assigned to was the first Dominion presence in this corridor since the border reckoning." He nodded slowly. The nod of a man counting years and finding the number too large to hold comfortably, not the nod of a commander reaching a tactical conclusion. Something older than that. "We walked back into its patrol area," he said. "Yes, sir." He did not say anything else. He looked at the display for several more minutes, and then the communications link established with the nearest surviving hull, and there were things to do. And he stood up and did them with the same composed precision he had shown throughout, because a commander's job does not stop when the engagement does, and Varath Sanul was, above everything else, someone who did his job. That was the last substantive conversation we had about the engagement. Everything else went into the inquiry record. The inquiry lasted 14 months. I gave testimony 11 times. I was asked many things, and I was honest in my answers, including the answer to the question that the senior analysts returned to most consistently. Whether I believed the permanent record had spared the 13 surviving hulls deliberately, or whether our survival was incidental, I always gave the same answer. I said I did not know. That remains true. I do not know. What I know is that the contact never closed distance, that it remained at its original engagement position for the full 4 hours and 17 minutes. That when the array's remnants drifted out of the formation envelope, the contact did not follow. That it broadcast its 2-word transmission 3 times at 31-second intervals and then stood down, and that what it stood down to was the same configuration it had been maintaining for 900 years, which was not dormancy, and was not absence, and was not anything the Dominion's archive had a useful word for. In the inquiry's final session, one of the senior analysts asked me what I thought the 31-second interval signified. I told her I had spent a great deal of time on that question and had produced only one answer that felt honest. She asked what it was. I said, "I think it was waiting to see if we would leave." The room was quiet for a moment. The senior analyst wrote something in her notation record. "What I meant was something about the nature of an engagement in which the outcome is not in doubt, and both parties know it, in which the question is not whether the thing with 17 concurrent spatial layers and 9 centuries of patience will neutralize the thing that found it, but whether the thing that found it will understand what it has encountered and withdraw." And what the 31-second interval felt like, sitting at my mapping station and watching the gray icons accumulate, was not the interval of a weapon cycling or a targeting system updating. It was the interval of something genuinely prepared to stop if we did, something that held its position not because it wanted to fight, but because it had been given the position and the corridor still required holding. And that would stop neutralizing the intruding force the moment the intruding force stopped being in the corridor. We did not leave. We had no doctrine for leaving under fire. By the time the possibility of withdrawal was operationally relevant, the array was reduced past the threshold at which withdrawal was achievable. And Varath Sanul, who was a good commander and a thorough commander and a commander who tried every adaptation available to him, was a commander whose doctrine had never included the option of withdrawal from an engagement as a correct response. 400 years of expansion without a failed engagement. The doctrine had never needed to contain the option of stopping. The permanent record waited 31 seconds, 219 times, and we did not leave, and it finished what we had made it start. 900 years of holding the position, and it was still there when we arrived, and it will be there when the next force arrives, and the one after that. I have been a mapper for 31 years now. I read every extinction file I encounter before I classify anything as a natural formation. And I have recommended avoidance of 47 anomalous spatial geometries that my seniors have subsequently reviewed and approved. And I have never been overruled without first making my case in writing and having it formally noted in the mission record. I am considered, in the Dominion's analytical community, a careful technician. I was a careful technician at 26 as well, and it did not help because carefulness operates downstream of the assumptions it works with. And the assumption that the extinction files contain extinct things was the one I had not questioned. I question it now. I question every notation I make now before I make it. This habit has cost me pace on every survey assignment since the engagement, and it has never once caused a senior officer to reconsider an approach that my preliminary findings counseled against. And I send my reports anyway, 3 times, at 31-second intervals, because the record should show that someone was paying attention. The anomaly at the far end of the current survey corridor is 4 days out. My instruments resolve it, at this distance, as a fold remnant stable, deep, 17 distinct spatial layers. Boundary lines between layers that are clean and even, and precise in the way that natural processes do not produce. The formation behind me is 11,400 vessels. The continuance commander is a methodical officer who briefed calmly this morning and assumed that the universe would behave according to the parameters his analysts have established for it. He spent 11 seconds on my preliminary sector report before moving on to the fuel consumption projections. My recommendations section reads, Halt approach. Full dimensional analysis prior to entry. Possible match for extinct classification humanity. Terran designation. File reference. File updated. I have already sent it 3 times at intervals of exactly 31 seconds because I want whoever reads it to understand that I understand what the interval means. And because I have been in the room where 31 seconds was not enough time and I would like more than I can properly express, for someone in a position to act on that understanding, to receive this report before the array closes to engagement range. I would like to say that this time will be different. I would like to say a great many things. I sit at my mapping station and I watch the anomaly's 17 layers maintain their patient geometry 4 days out, and I wait to find out if anyone in this formation is listening. And I am aware in a way that is entirely cold and entirely clear and costs me something I did not know I had left to spend that one of us in this corridor has been waiting for a very long time. It is not me, and it is not afraid. And the file it updated is not the only file that has been closed in this corridor. There are other corridors. There are other surveys. There are other extinction notations in the archive's deep storage, filed by committees who looked at silence and saw completion. I think about this. I think about it every day. The file is still open.